Putin has been threatening tactical nuclear attack in Ukraine almost since the day that he invaded. So, in a way, I think his crying wolf, that idea has now gone because he's threatened it so much and nothing has happened. However, with the Americans out of the game, one could, would, if Russia decided to drop a tactical nuclear weapon in not just Ukraine, but say in Poland or somewhere like that, how would Britain and France react? Are we going to fire a strategic nuclear weapon at Moscow? I would suggest we probably wouldn't, and I think that's the assumption that Putin has probably made, which is why it makes it dangerous.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Hamish De Bretton Gordon, a former British Army officer, NATO commander and military analyst who is on the show regularly. Hamish, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Should we ever have had any faith in President Putin's promise of an Easter ceasefire?
No, I don't think we should. Ceasefires have come and gone over the last few months, and although initially the Russians and Putin have been very positive, actually when it comes down to deeds rather than words, that they have failed to live up to expectations. And I think when this ceasefire over Easter, to me, seems a pretty cynical ploy when you look at what else is going on at the moment. Trump and Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, threatening to walk away from the peace negotiations. Then we get Putin coming up with what was a fairly factious offer, a little more than a day's ceasefire over a religious period. Putin claiming to be a very serious Christian. However, his deeds would lead you to suggest what particular Bible that he reads and adheres to. So I think the ceasefire was just another bit of gamesmanship by Putin. And I suppose we shall see whether Trump and his team are taken in by it when they come back to work tomorrow.
And is it possible, especially in the Russian military, to even call a halt to fighting that quickly and for such a short period as well?
Well, in a way, it might be possible because the way that the Russian army is commanded, it's commanded and controlled at the very highest level, which is the opposite to sort of Western militaries. So Putin and his senior generals actually make most of the decisions at what we call the tactical level. In other words, fighting at the front. And because of the way the sort of bullying command structure the Russians have, junior officers are terrified of making any decisions in case they're the wrong ones. And the Russian military leads from behind. That might sound like an oxymoron, but it's the people at the back telling the people at the front what to do, which is why we've seen them sort of so ineffective and having so many huge casualties. So if President Putin says stop fighting, then actually there is a possibility that could happen. Conversely, with the Western military, the British military, where most of the decisions are made at the lowest levels, the chain of command, as we call it, how long it takes decisions from the top to get to the bottom. In the British military can take some time, but in the Russian military, not very long. So, yeah, if Putin was absolutely serious about this ceasefire, it would have been possible for the people at the very front line to know that he wanted a ceasefire and to stop firing. So the fact that nothing really happened really, I think, explains to everybody that this was a complete paper tiger. There was no substance to it except a bit of verbiage that he would hope to hoodwink Putin with, rather Putin to hoodwink Trump with, which he's been rather good at hitherto.
And as you say, there is this... the Russians do have this power to bring things to a halt relatively quickly then. In that case, is there a chance of the ceasefire maybe restarting or perhaps being extended? Ukraine were open to the idea, although, as you say, rightfully sceptical.
Well, I think we've really got to look at the Kremlin and Putin, what they've been saying. They have stated their aims very clearly, that they want to completely subjugate Ukraine to start with, and then the old Soviet states, the Baltics and elsewhere, Romania, Bulgaria, sort of thing. That is Putin's ultimate aim. He's been telling us this for years. The other aim is to decouple Europe from the US. Now, Putin thinks that he is achieving all of those. So why on earth would he want to go for a ceasefire? He's done a great job of decoupling the states from Europe, and the Steve Witkoff, the envoy to Ukraine, who seems to spend most of his time in Moscow, and even Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, recently have really been singing the Russian song and not the Ukrainian song. So, Putin, thinks that he's very much on the front foot, and why on earth would he go for a ceasefire? So, with Trump initially saying he'd end the war in 24 hours before he became president, and then with these sort of sequential claims that he's going to end the war, apparently he's going to end it this week. That might be in his own mind, but he's obviously not listening to Putin, and he seems to be encouraging rather than discouraging Putin's thought. So, of course, there is a chance to the ceasefire, because that's, the Ukrainians are prepared to do that. But what they're not prepared for is an unjust ceasefire. And I think the European NATO countries are not prepared to allow Ukraine to go into an unjust ceasefire. And certainly a lot of the stuff being talked about at the moment from the negotiators like Witkoff and Rubio, you could sort of think that the Russians might agree to it, giving up Crimea and giving up the totality of the four oblasts, which Russia has illegally invaded, whereas really offering very little to Ukraine except to strip them of their rare earth minerals and hundreds of billions of dollars, worth of money that should be helping feed the Ukrainians rather than going into the pockets of Trump and his close allies.
And every time we see one of these ceasefires proposed, we often quite quickly afterwards, regardless of whether or not it's signed, see it be almost weaponized by Russia to try and make out to the Americans especially that Ukraine doesn't listen to ceasefires and they're attacking anyway. At what point do we reach a point where, we get a crying wolf situation where Ukraine just won't trust any suggestion of a ceasefire because it will just be used against them?
Well, that is absolutely right. It was bizarre. Minutes into the ceasefire, Russia was claiming that the Ukrainians had ignored it, but of course at the same time, air raid sirens were going off in Kyiv and Kherson and elsewhere, and Russian missiles and rockets were raining down. Now, and it would seem, that probably the Ukrainians kept firing as well. I mean, there did seem to be, in a place like Kherson, there did appear to be a lot less fire than had been usually the case. So, there was some mileage to it. But yeah, I think there is very little trust between Kyiv and Moscow at the moment, and quite rightly. We only, I think we discussed last week the horrendous attack in Sumy, which killed 34 civilians. Again, Putin has claimed he does not attack civilian targets. He doesn't attack schools and hospitals, but quite clearly he does. So that is a real challenge. And when we're hoping that Trump would be an honest broker in all of this, he is doing this deal as though he was buying and selling real estate, not as though he was trying to, save lives of civilians and innocent people caught up in this fighting.
And is there any reason, especially at this point, for these two militaries to halt fighting without a third party like the US enforcing any sort of ceasefire? I mean, is there precedent for that?
Well, I'm sure there must be precedent, but at the moment it seems very unlikely. It would appear that the Ukrainians are happy to cease fighting now, because the actual fighting as such is pretty much stalemate. Few gains are made here, bit of ground taken here, lost there. We're very much at a similar position as we were in probably 1917 in the First World War. We've got 1,000 miles of contact line, ostensibly trenches facing trenches, and there is very little movement going on, and probably little prospect. I mean, the only way the Russians have made any ground in the last sort of 6 months is by the extensive use of chemical weapons, which we sort of may come on to. But as far as maneuver warfare, tanks steaming across lines and making huge gains, that is highly unlikely, because the Russians are not trained to do that sort of thing, and the Ukrainians probably just can't generate enough fighting power to do it. So we are pretty much deadlocked. So unless somebody goes to the extreme, unless, for instance, Putin decides to deploy some tactical nuclear weapons, it would seem unlikely that they are going to make huge strides into Ukraine. And it is unlikely that Russia can hold on and keep fighting and fighting and fighting forever. So I think we are at a stalemate. But without somebody like the US to broker this peace, it seems, certainly not in Putin's mind to go for it. Because, as we discussed at the beginning, Putin thinks he's winning and he thinks he can still achieve his objectives. And if Trump is retreating to the west side of the Atlantic and focusing on, mainland USA and making America rich again, then he is going to want to decouple himself from Europe, I expect. So at the moment, Putin thinks that there is a chance he can achieve both of his aims, decoupling Europe from US. One could argue he's already achieved that.
And we did hear these warnings from Kiev about the possibility of a new Russian offensive in the east and south of Ukraine. But it sounds like, to your mind, the Russians really aren't ready to fight a new full-blown offensive.
No, I don't think they are. And I think the intelligence flowing into Ukraine for its deep strategic strikes is still pretty good. I must say they are getting a lot of it themselves. So the idea that if America again pulls the plug on intelligence, that's the end of Ukraine. That's not quite true. So I think Ukraine still has the ability to strike deep. It still has the capability, and a lot of it now in indigenous stuff they've developed themselves, long-range drones. So it's not all about US ATACMS and HIMARS and about British Storm Shadow, which are probably getting low. But the German decision to deploy Taurus is pretty significant, and I know that Britain has got behind that. But when it comes on to the possibility of Russia doing some big ground maneuver, I think that is highly unlikely, for the reasons that I've said about Ukraine being able to strike these build-ups, but also to do combined arms maneuver. This is tanks with drones, with artillery, takes a heck of a lot of training. And we now know, and when I trained my regiment to do this, it probably took 2 years. We know with the conscripts coming into the Russian army now, they're lucky to get a few weeks training, not months and years. So that would be, that's why I sort of discount it. The only operations the Russians are doing at the moment are at platoon level, which is about 30 men, or very occasionally at company level, which may be up to 60 or 70, and only for very short periods. So I think the idea that they're going to sweep up into southern Ukraine with thousands of tanks is just, that is not happening. That might be coming out of Russian bots as part of their propaganda and disinformation, but it's fiction. It would not happen. They do not have the capability to do it.
And even if they did have this equipment, I mean, we're hearing of Russia launching new mechanized attacks around Zaporizhia in recent weeks, but those reportedly have largely been halted, in part due to Ukrainian drone surveillance and those drone strikes that we see so much of. What does this tell us about the way this conflict has kind of changed the nature of warfare?
I'm not sure it's changed the nature of warfare. It's warfare is still a dreadful business of those who can generate the most fighting power are going to make progress. I mean, the fighting we're seeing now is absolutely what we saw in the First World War. Sure, there weren't drones, but there were spotters in balloons, and there were aircraft flying around. And I think that the drone is, that is what this war is synonymous with. But it's just another capability. And I think what has been very interesting is mass. When I say mass, it's really about numbers and generating fighting power. And that's what drones have managed to do, using AI, and using cheap off the shelf stuff that you and I can buy, has enabled both sides to create this sort of this really hard fighting power. However, it's a balance, and when there is a counter to drone, and we're already seeing it with electronic warfare, we're seeing it with multiple low cost lasers, which will come online very soon. Actually, the drone swarms that we're seeing at the moment will be less effective, and then something else will take it over. So I don't think warfare has changed so much. We are seeing a trench warfare, which at the moment is pretty much stalemate. And one side gets an advantage somewhere, and then somebody else gets an advantage elsewhere. What is clear is that neither side, even the Russians, can generate the fighting power to make a decisive move that could topple things over. And I think that is why people are hoping now that the Kremlin will realize that. But unfortunately, it's not so much the Kremlin; it's Putin. Putin knows that if he does not succeed to his aims, Russian dictators fairly live in happy retirement and collect their pension. So we've got to really know what Putin's all about. So any sort of capitulation by him at this moment, he knows, is the end of him as president of the Russian Federation. And there are no shortage of people in Russia who would like to take over. So nature of warfare it changes only with what sort of capability is used, but the fundamentals are still the same. And I think that's why I personally believe we are at this sort of stalemate that could only be broken by hopefully a ceasefire or some demonstrative action. On the Russian side, as I suggested, tactical nuclear weapons. On the Ukraine side, European NATO going full in behind, or the Americans. If the Americans put their military might behind Ukraine, then Russia would very quickly collapse in its attack to Ukraine. And in a similar vein, if European NATO countries put their boots on the ground, that would happen again. I mean, we've slightly been seduced by Russia. Everybody thinking the Russian economy is massive and endless, but it's actually half the size of the British economy. And as far as when it comes to military capability is concerned, they've lost allegedly 4,000 tanks already. They've lost up to 1 million men injured and wounded. This is even on First World War scales, this is unsustainable. So unless any of those two things change on either side, that's why I sort of think we're in stalemate. And at the moment, it doesn't appear that either of those would change. And which is why, let's hope that Trump's threat this week, as it were, to end the war this week happens. But I think all of those of us who've been following this war for the last 3 years, and particularly Trump for the last 3 months, we're not betting our house on it, sadly.
So if we have reached that sort of stalemate on the front line, should we be watching perhaps more carefully those deep strikes by the Ukrainians and strikes by Russians as well, for that matter?
Well, yeah, all these sort of deep strikes, what we call shaping the battlefield, and Ukraine has done pretty well at this. And some of its strikes into we've discussed of destroying 96 cruise missiles a few weeks ago deep in Russia, Russian combat aircraft, and also drones flying into Moscow. These are all starting to have a psychological impact on the Russian people who, hitherto one's been surprised why the sort of mothers of Russia and the Russian people aren't making more of a statement about the fact that their economy's tanked. They can hardly afford bread, etc., etc., etc. And that millions there or thousands of the young men are coming back in body bags. I think there are a whole host of reasons for it. One I understand is that the conscripts are seen as mercenaries in Russia because they're paid a lot more money than the average person working in the street, and there is not that sort of Russian fatherland sort of attachment to them that perhaps there was in the past. But people are now realizing that the sort of the lies they've been sold by Putin are actually lies, and it's really beginning to hit them hard. So that is an issue that's going to affect them. Of course, they'll keep their deep strikes going on, and we've discussed the attacks in Sumy and elsewhere. But if Ukraine still is topped up with the air defense weapons, Patriot missiles, etc., etc., hopefully it will be able to knock the majority out of the sky that it is doing. But again, on both sides, it still seems to be pretty much a stalemate. So I don't think it's going to demonstrably change the shape of the war by deep strikes by Russian or Ukrainian. Although if Ukraine can hit some key targets and say Moscow or St. Petersburg, then that will start getting people agitated and start sort of knocking on the door at the Kremlin, I expect.
And you mentioned earlier the use of chemical weapons by the Russians. The UK has now started to send gas masks to Ukraine to help combat those increasing chemical warfare attacks by Russia. Did this happen quick enough, though?
Well, I think with all gifting of military equipment to Ukraine, it's not a lesson, it's a fact. None of it has happened quick enough. Had we given them thousands of tanks on day one, had we given them air defense, had we given them fighter jets straight away, then we'd be in a different position. I think on the chemical side, we've been discussing, I've been reporting for the last 18 months, the huge use of riot control agents, which although they are deemed as chemical weapons, it was a grey area. And I think people, particularly politicians in this country and in Europe and the States, just didn't realize the impact of this stuff. It was having a huge impact. But luckily now people are being convinced that the way to, like any threat, there's always a mitigation. And actually the use of chemical weapons, the mitigation is fairly easy. You just need a decent gas mask. And the Ukrainians had old Russian gas masks, which, to put it crudely, are rubbish. They just don't work. So it's a good thing for Britain to do. We are the biggest and best producer of gas masks in the world. And it's taken a while for people to realize that. But I understand about 65,000 British gas masks are on the way to the front line now. And when, the most of the soldiers on the front line have a gas mask, these attacks will become less effective. I mean, it's very simple. So, yes, had it been given a year ago, it would have been much better. But in this war, it's easy to look back, but actually it doesn't really help. One must try and look forward and must try and make decisions as quickly as we can in order to support the Ukrainians, rather than worry too much about whether we're doing it's the right bit of kit that they need. Much better to give it early and find out that it doesn't work than find out actually we should have given it 6 or 7 months ago. But this is a good thing, and I think this will have a major impact on the front line.
Well, another pretty crucial piece of equipment was the German Leopard 2 tank, which Ukraine has now been using since 2023, I believe. It's had some difficulties in Ukraine, though, hasn't it? I mean, what have we learnt about the use of this tank in this modern conflict?
Well, it is a really interesting example, and as a ex-tank commander and tank regiment commander myself, it's something very close to my heart. But it is a classic story of actually of German tanks throughout history. The Leopard 2 tank in itself is an excellent vehicle. It's a sort of it's the Rolls Royce of the tank, if you like. However, it comes with a number of issues that have been highlighted in Ukraine. I think those of us who've studied it a lot are not too surprised. It's a brilliant tank, but there are very few of them, and it's very technical. Takes a lot of time to train. I mean, it's very similar to the British Challenger 2, which I spent many thousands of hours on. But for me, even an experienced tank commander, it would take me a couple of weeks or months to get adept at it. Whereas we're putting Ukrainian people soldiers in there who don't necessarily have that time. Because it's so technically advanced, it's not very easy to repair. I mean, that might sound counterintuitive. When I first tank I was on was the Chieftain tank, which was designed in the 1950s. If the engine didn't work, you generally needed a hammer. And if the hammer didn't work, you needed a bigger hammer. And eventually you got a hammer that worked and the thing would go. Whereas with a Leopard 2, if the engine doesn't work, you basically, what the Ukrainians are having to do is move it hundreds of miles from the front line and repair it or change the engine. That is just not viable. And Russian tanks are very basic and very simple. Many people might have heard of the T-34 in the Second World War. There were tens of thousands of them. They were very simple and very easy to use. And the engines, if they broke, they were very easy to fix. You can fix a Russian, any auto mechanic can fix a Russian tank, but you need a specialist to fix the Leopard. So I think that they're in the issue there, and the numbers. And we talk about mass, and I've talked about mass many times, but I think in the West we've been seduced by technology. Just let's have a few really clever bits of kit. Well, that's all right up to a point, but if you lose one of those very clever, very expensive bits of kit, you've lost a lot of your capability. So I think 18 Leopard 2s, they might be able to take out, each one of them 5 Russian tanks, but the Russians have got thousands. And it was the same in the Second World War. Many people have heard of the German Tiger tank, which was an amazing tank, but the Germans only made about 1,000 of them, whereas the Allies had 69,000 Sherman tanks, which were very simple, very basic. And there's a famous story at the Battle of Anzio in Italy when the Allies landed, and the German defending general telling Patton that his Tigers were taking out, 10 or so Shermans for each Tiger tank. And Patton said, "Doesn't matter. I've got hundreds of tanks and you haven't." I mean, this sounds a bit banal, but that is the warfare we're seeing in Ukraine, where, the Russians have the mass of manpower, and they, as we've discussed, the casualties they've had, and they have the mass of armor. And, had we given the Ukrainians hundreds of Leopards and hundreds of Challengers, it might have been a different position. But if you just give a few, once they break down, that's sort of it. It doesn't matter if they've taken out 3 or 4 of the enemy, because the enemy has still got loads and loads to go. So I think that is the issue. Inherently, the Leopard 2 is not a bad tank, but it's not performed well in Ukraine because of the issues highlighted.
And the war in Ukraine is perhaps increasingly becoming a more European war as the Trump administration seeks to step back from this conflict, seemingly. How much should the UK, and France for that matter, be concerned about their nuclear arsenals if they become the only allies of Ukraine that have that nuclear deterrence capability? How do their capabilities match Russia's as well?
Well, I think this is an important issue. It's a bit of an elephant in the room that people won't want to discuss. I wrote about it in some detail last week, really relating to the Strategic Defence Review, the British Strategic Defence Review. Because when you look at nuclear across the planet, I think people are aware of the mutually assured destruction of nuclear conflict, which has prevented Armageddon. The idea that between the opposing forces, predominantly the West and Russia, there is equilibrium in strategic nuclear weapons. In other words, if the Russians kicked off, they know that the Americans and ourselves, although Russia has the capability to destroy us, at the same time, Russia would be destroyed as well. And that equilibrium has kept the peace for, the last 80 years. However, if US is stepping back, you're absolutely right. In Europe, the French and ourselves have strategic nuclear capability. And although a lot smaller than the Russians, it is enough to inflict severe damage on Russia, and Russia knows that. However, what is not in equilibrium is what we call tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons. We in Britain gave up our last tactical nuclear weapon in 1998. And these are, people say they're small nuclear weapons. So they're actually used on the battlefield to take out sort of bases and masses of armor. But, they are still huge. And Russia has a lot of them. And in fact, Putin has been threatening tactical nuclear attack in Ukraine almost since the day that he invaded. So in a way, I think his crying wolf, that idea has now gone because, he's threatened it so much and nothing has happened. However, with the Americans out of the game, one could, would, if Russia decided to drop a tactical nuclear weapon in not just Ukraine, but say in Poland or somewhere like that, how would Britain and France react? Are we going to fire a strategic nuclear weapon at Moscow? I would suggest we probably wouldn't. And I think that's the assumption that Putin has probably made, which is why it makes it dangerous. Now, it's true that the French do have some tactical nuclear weapons. And I would hope that the Strategic Defence Review that is due to report soon, although we understand it's stuck at the moment in the Prime Minister's pending tray, will look at these issues because, or however abhorrent it seems to, talk about nuclear, actually, it is a way to generate force that, thousands and thousands of tanks just cannot do. And it's all about equilibrium when it comes to nuclear. And at the moment, Europe and Russia are not in equilibrium when we're talking tactical nuclear weapons.
Well, Hamish De Bretton Gordon, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.